passing around is a squash bug management card, which we'll cover in a bit. I made a printout of some of the common insects and diseases we're going to talk about. And then I printed off a spray table of different fungicide and insecticide options that we'll also cover. So go ahead and...
So 3 pass around.
Perfect. Yep, so 3 different things. Go ahead and pass those around. So to introduce myself, my name is Nick Valesky. I work for Utah State University Extension's Integrated Pest Management Program. So I work a lot with our state's vegetable production producers, so specifically on diseases and insect pest management. So this morning we're going to talk about different arthropod and disease pests that we see in pumpkins, most commonly in Utah. So we're focusing on pumpkins, but a lot of these pests that we're going to cover, they can affect all our cucurbit crops. So this can include melons, winter squashes, and summer squashes. So here are some 4 of the most common arthropod pests, and then we're going to focus on the identification, monitoring, and then management. So the first one that you guys are probably familiar with is aphids. So there's several different types of aphids. The one that we usually see on our cucurbit crops is the melon aphid. So I'm also going to pass around this collection of, I brought actual specimens of the insects that you guys can get a closer look at and you can familiarize yourself with. So they're all in here. So the first one is the melon aphid. So you guys can carefully pass that around, familiarize yourself with these different insect pests and what they look like. So the melon aphid, these are really, really small. So these are small, soft-bodied insects. They're only about 1 to 1.5 millimeters big. So you're going to find them living in colonies underneath the leaves. So they can actually have 2 color forms. They could be yellow like this or kind of a black, dark green color. And again, you'll find them in kind of colonies on the undersides of the leaves. And here's a photo I found of some that were on the flower of the plant. So you also might find white shedded skins that the aphids cast off when they molt. And sometimes growers will confuse those as white flies. But again, they're just the molted skins of the aphids. As they grow and develop, they'll cast those off. And these melon aphids, where they're going to go in the wintertime is they're going to overwinter on different woody hosts. So specifically on our catalpa trees or Rosa Sharon. So if you have those in your landscape, that could be an overwintering site for the melon aphids. So aphids are problems because they have these piercing, sucking mouth parts. So here's kind of a close-up image. You can see where it's biting into the vine of the plant. And the damage they do is not so much destructive themselves, but what our real concern is they can vector different viruses. So we'll cover different viruses of pumpkins later on, but that's our main concern with these aphids.
So if we haven't tested that they don't have AIDS, it's all right, then we don't have to worry about it?
So aphids are actually asexual. They don't lay eggs, they're just going to reproduce. They clone themselves, basically. So did you know that? No. Yeah, so they're... Yeah, so aphids, they're just going to reproduce in these colonies. So the adult female, they'll just clone themselves, and then that's how their life cycle works. And they can reproduce rapidly.
So that middle photo,
yeah.
you say that was just a cast off of...
Nope, so these are the actual yellow ones of the yellow form. So this is actually a pumpkin leaf, and you can see this was on the underside. This was a whole colony. So when you guys are looking at your plants, be sure to check the undersides of the leaves and all the different kind of nooks and crannies of the plant and be mindful of where these aphids might be.
All 3,000 square feet.
Yeah. So to manage them, one of the most kind of obvious things we can do is we can just knock them down by spraying a strong stream of water on them. So if you see a colony, you can just spray them down with some water. Another option is different insecticides. So on that handout, I listed a bunch of products that are registered to control aphids here in Utah. So different active ingredients like melithium, bifenthrin, cyfluthrin, pyrethrins. There's also organic options like different plant-based horticultural oils like neem oil, and then different insecticidal soaps. So when you're spraying that, you want to make sure you're directly spraying that aphid colony. And you want to make sure that you're covering them directly. So if you're just standing far away and spraying the plant, you're not quite sure if you're hitting those aphids. So that's the important thing when you are spraying any sort of product, even the strong stream of water. And then of course there's always natural predators out there, so different biocontrol measures. So here's an image of a parasitic wasp, different lady beetles, lacewings. Those can all help with the overall control process. So the next one we'll talk about is squash bugs, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. I handed out those little blue cards you can look at for different ways we can manage them. But I'm sure you guys already know, but to familiarize yourself with squash bugs, this is what the adult looks like. They're about 5/8 of an inch long. They're gray, black, kind of a brown in color. And they have these distinct kind of orange little stripes on the side of their thorax, or along the sides of their abdomen. And then the undersides of their wings, when you see them fly, there's actually kind of a bright red color underneath. And then the eggs you should also be familiar with. They're kind of these bronze, orange, brown colored, and they're laid in clusters, usually on the undersides of our cucurbit leaves. Sometimes you'll find them in obscure other spots, but usually when you're out looking for them, you want to look for them on the undersides of the leaves. So when those eggs hatch, the young squash bug nymphs, they're called, those are the really young squash bugs. They kind of look like little spiders. They're bright green color, and you'll find them kind of congregating at the base of the plant. And as they grow and develop, they're going to go through these different instars, and they'll start to more closely resemble the adult squash bugs. So squash bugs, similar to the aphids, they have these long, piercing, sucking mouth parts. So here's a photo of one I found last summer. And what they do is at the base of the plant, they're going to bite the plant, and they're going to disrupt that xylem and phloem flow within the plant. So that's where you get this wilting that's happening. So if you see this in your pumpkins or other cucumber production, you see wilting, that could be an indication that there's squash bugs. So that's when you want to go out and check the base of the plants for those adults feeding. So to manage them, we have several options. The first one is we want to minimize the overwintering site. So squash bugs, how they're staying in our landscape over the winter is they're looking for crop debris, ground cover, or like nearby wood piles. So at the end of the season, if you get rid of all those crop debris, nearby wood piles, you're going to reduce that overwintering site for the adult squash bugs. The second thing we can do is we can be out monitoring for those egg masses. So one technique I like to do, especially this might work really well if you're only working with a few pumpkin plants, is take a roll of duct tape and just peel those eggs off, or you can just crush them. If you do this early on in the season, that can really help knock down the populations. Sometimes growers might consider using traps, so they can lay down a piece of wood, cardboard near their site, and then at night, those squash bugs are going to seek shelter under there, or even sometimes during the day. And then the next morning, you can lift that up, and then you can collect those squash bugs and destroy them then and there.
You need a good light bear cardboard.
Yeah. So one study that we did up on the USU farms is we looked at the different trap cropping methods. So one kind of tried and true method is the use of the blue Hubbard squash, which has been shown to be really attractive to squash bugs. So we planted those on, so the pumpkins I grew, they were in like a huge field. So this may not be as effective if you're just growing a few plants. But in that huge pumpkin field, we planted blue Hubbard squashes on the field borders. And when we had the students go out and do like the squash bug counts, we found that they preferred the blue Hubbard squash a lot more. So if if you were like a large producer, then you could just spray or treat the blue Hubbard squash instead of your actual pumpkins. Yes.
I've heard that they attack the zucchini plants before they attack the pumpkin.
Yeah, so they're gonna go for those summer squashes that are more mature and grow faster than our winter squashes like our pumpkins. So kind of another thing, I kind of talked about on that card about the timing of planting. So if you want to avoid them, which you can't really do with the giant pumpkins because you're starting those early, but your other crops, if you want to plant them later in the season, you can miss out on that overwintering adult population that's coming out.
That definitely does work.
Yeah.
The trap crop will work on these.
So in that display I'm handing around, there's a specific parasitic fly called a tachinid fly that loves squash bugs and true bugs. So if you saw on this photo, whoops, wrong one, wrong way. There's a little white dot right here. So that's actually the egg of that fly that I'm passing around. And when that egg hatches, the larvae is going to crawl inside to the squash bug and they're going to kill it. So,
Where do I buy those flies?
so you can't buy these on the market, and I wouldn't fully rely on them for entire control because
Do you have a video in real time?
no. No, the best I got is like those specimens. So,
They lay eggs in like grasshoppers too.
so not this species. There are tons of parasitic insects out there but this one is specifically host specific to squash bugs and other true bugs like stink bugs. Okay, and then of course I listed some insecticide options. So again, those are on that sheet I handed out. But some of the more systematic ones are pyrethrins, zeta-cypermethrin, and permethrins. And the thing with insecticides, if you are gonna use them, you wanna make sure you're targeting those young nymph stages because the adult structure, they're a little more resistant to different sprays, but the younger, more soft-bodied nymphs would be more susceptible to those sprays. And again, when you are spraying them, you want to make sure that you're finding them and spraying them directly. You're not just spraying around.
Is there something systemic we can put on our plants to kill them?
Yeah. So what I listed here is the active ingredients. On that chart, there's like some actual brand names. I think 7 is zeta-cypermethrin, but these active ingredients like pyrethrins, permethrins, and then there's a few others that just look for different products at your local garden store that have those active ingredients in them. So, yes.
I've always, the problem with some of the insecticides, I think, is, you kill the bug, but if they've already bitten the plant, is there any kind of like repellent, insect repellent?
Yeah, exactly. So you want to try to get the squash bugs early on. So there isn't any repellents. Some of the products might be listed as systemic, so that means you could spray it, then they'll avoid that area. You just want to make sure to read that label. I would have to study the active ingredients a little more, but look on that table I handed out. Okay, any other yeah?
Yeah, so is there anything you can do about the eggs other than like peel them off and stuff? Aren't they kind of resistant to the chemicals and stuff?
They are, because obviously like the egg casing, like they're gonna not.
It's gonna work trying to collect eggs.
Yeah, yeah,
Is there anything you spray?
You can fry them up after.
yeah. You can definitely,
If you can see them, you can pick them off.
yeah, that. If you don't want to actually like pick them off, some people just cut them out. You can put petroleum jelly on them, or just squish the eggs themselves when you find them. Okay, so we're gonna shift gears. We're gonna talk about cucumber beetles. So the two that we predominantly see in Utah are the western spotted cucumber beetle and the western striped cucumber beetle. So obviously they're yellow. They're about 1/3 of an inch long. I think, yeah, in that case, I'm passing around, there's some specimens in there that you can see. And then the spotted one, obviously they have the black spots in like 3 different rows with 12 black spots. And then this one has the 3 kind of more uniform black stripes on it. The larvae look like little white worms, and the species of, I believe it's the spotted one, can also damage plants. They'll feed into the root system or the crown of the plant like this. So again, you can see that little white larva with the brown head just feeding through. And then the eggs, here's an image, they can be kind of a yellow, dark orange colored, and they're laid in clusters like this. And in Utah, they'll have about multiple generations per year, depending on your specific climate region. So I know we're getting a lot warmer, so we might be able to start seeing 2 to 3 generations of these a year. And the adults are what can cause the primary feeding damage. So like other leaf-feeding beetles, they'll feed on the foliage. So early on in the season, you want to look out for them especially when you have those young plants. They'll feed on the first true leaves or the cotyledons. And because those plants are so small, that's going to kill them off. Usually later in the season when the plant's a lot bigger, it can withstand a lot more damage. And at the end of the season, they'll also feed on the rinds of the plant, which can cause a lot of damage to the fruit of the plant itself, which can allow for infection and just aesthetic damage in general. So to manage cucumber beetles, here are some 3 things you can do. If you guys are familiar with Emery County down in central Utah, they have a lot of watermelon production. So they deal a lot with cucumber beetles. One thing they do is they do these cool pheromone traps where they set up these milk jugs that are painted yellow, and you can see little punched holes in there, and they'll put the pheromone in there. So all the beetles that are in the area, they're going to go directly to these traps and get caught in there. So this is something that growers will do on a large scale.
Did Utah State put the ones in Wheeler Farm? I saw some Wheeler Farm.
Yep, they helped with that. So the ones you saw there might have been stink bug traps, but there's a different website, it's called Alpha Sense, where you can buy different pheromones for specific insects. And there's not one on the market right now for squash bugs. So I know that's what you're thinking, but they do have one for the cucumber beetles. So then you can just capture a bunch and destroy them. But if you're just working in a small backyard, one option is to use a row cover, which a lot of you guys already do for season extension. So that will obviously physically exclude cucumber beetles and other pests from accessing the plant. And then you just want to make sure to remove them for pollination. So of course there are insecticide options. Different groups like carbamates, organophosphates, and synthetic pyrethroids. So look for products at the garden store or wherever that have those types of active ingredients. Those are labeled to control cucumber beetles. But again, remember, when you are spraying those insecticides, it's only going to work if you make sure that you spray the base of the plant or the foliage to make sure you actually hit the cucumber beetles. And you want to make sure they're actually there as well.
So it's a contact.
Yep.
It has to touch them.
Yep. Okay, so spider mites we were talking about earlier. They're super small. They're actually not insects. They're tiny little arachnids. You need like a hand lens or a microscope to see them clearly. So here's kind of a zoomed out photo. And they get the name spider mites because they develop this webbing. So if there's a large group of them, you might see them on the plant. They're really common in greenhouses, or if you guys have like house plants, you might find spider mites on there. In northern Utah, we'll have just about 1 generation a year. If you live in farther south, there might be kind of a partial second generation. And the thing about spider mites is they thrive in hot, dry, dusty conditions. So our kind of semi-arid climate here in Utah, they do really well in. And they like the dusty conditions as well. So if you live near like a dirt road and there's just a lot of dust or soil, that's something they'll thrive in. And they're often found on the underside of the foliage. So here's an image. This is the top side of a cucurbit leaf. And you can see all these little white spots. So this is from their feeding. We call this like stippling or flecking on the foliage. And then here's the undersides where you can see kind of the darker red form of the spider mites. There's just a whole bunch of them just really going to town on this leaf. So that's kind of the main damage we'll see with spider mites. To manage them, we usually tell growers to avoid the broad spectrum insecticides just because spider mites can develop a lot of resistance to different products. But there are different organic options like those horticultural oils like neem oil, different plant-based oils, or different insecticidal soaps. But again, if you're using the soaps, obviously do not spray in the heat because that's gonna harm the plant's foliage itself. So again, on that table, I think there are some other products listed for spider mites. And then, of course, frequent and uniform irrigation can prevent drought stress. Spraying directly on the infestation, similar to aphids, can help knock those populations down. And then, of course, like I was saying, you don't want to avoid the broad spectrum ones because there are beneficial mites that eat the bad mites. So we don't want to hurt those guys if we don't have to. So any questions about spider mites?
Does anybody here have problem with spider mites? I've had them in my greenhouse, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had them
I had
lots
some
of times.
last year.
They're a big problem in Utah's corn production as well because they like the different grass family crops. But really they can affect, so this information can apply to your pumpkins and all of your vegetables as well. Yeah.
I have something that it looks like spider mites, but it's also always the very oldest leaves.
Yeah.
Now, do they attack the oldest leaves, or is it just their old leaves?
They just might be the older leaves. They'll definitely start in the base of the plant and then move up. So if you look really closely, maybe try to bring out a hand lens, you can see if you can identify that stippling damage. And then if enough of them are feeding, that can eventually kill off the leaf. So it might look like kind of older foliage damage.
Yeah, I've never seen the stippling, but I've seen if you flip the leaf over, you can kind of see the white
Yeah.
threads. Kind of looks like webbing.
Yep.
And if you have a black piece of paper and you tap them.
Yeah. So that's a good method for spider mites and other insects as well, is to hold a piece of paper under the foliage, shake it, and you can see what different pests you might have.
It looks like a dot.
Yeah, they're really tiny.
Of a pen dot that walks around.
And if they've moved around after half an hour or so, you have mites, right?
Yeah. Okay, so those are some of the common arthropods. There's other ones too that we can talk about in a bit if we have time, but I just want to cover some diseases. So we have different viruses. We talked about powdery mildew a bit earlier. And then I was excited, we were talking about Fusarium and verticillium wilt, which is a cool one, and then different rots. So we'll talk about the identification, monitoring, and management. So in our cucurbit production, there's several different types of viruses. And to add to the complexity, there's different strains of these viruses. So the common ones that I've personally seen, and so I should preface, when we test for a virus, it's kind of like human viruses. So we have to do a PCR test. So we take it to our Utah Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab up in Logan, and that's how we test to actually find out specifically what virus it is. But I'll just kind of talk about them all as a group because a lot of the symptoms are similar and the management techniques are similar as well. But if you guys are familiar with the beet curly top virus, that affects a lot of our crops. So here's an image of that where it's just kind of the yellow, kind of stunted growth. And then the rest of these viruses, like the cucumber mosaic, zucchini yellow mosaic, and watermelon mosaic virus, they cause these kind of bubbling characteristics on the foliage you can see, and kind of distortion of the leaves. If you guys seen herbicide damage on broadleaf plants, it kind of looks similar to that. And then the fruits themselves will become small and distorted, and they kind of have these kind of bumps and lesions on them.
And it tends to affect the newer growth, right? Instead of the older
So viruses can affect any growth at any point of the plant. So a lot of these viruses are spread by the aphids, which we talked about earlier. So we want to focus our management on them. Some viruses are spread through just handling the plant. So like if you're clipping one plant, moving into the next one, you could be spreading that virus. And of course, you want to source certified disease-free seed because sometimes the virus can spread through the seed that way.
So we soak our seeds before they, in Travis's presentation, we soak them in hydrogen peroxide.
Yep.
Is that going to kill the...
Yeah. So different seed treatments can help monitor not only virus disease, but other bacterial and fungal diseases as well.
So is it in the seed itself, or is it on the...
So some of these viruses just might already be in the seed, but the treatment's still really good, again, for those other types of diseases.
Like some of it, like if you had powdery mildew or something in that plant and you use that seed without soaking it, it could just...
Yeah, so powdery mildew actually won't spread through the seed. So powdery mildew overwinters in the landscape itself. So it just needs a little bit of plant debris, so usually from the previous season. So if you still have plant debris from last season at your site, then there's that risk for the powdery mildew to be present again. So the cool thing about
Or your neighbors.
yeah. So the cool thing about powdery mildew is there's several different species, and different species are host specific. So I listed the two here that affect our cucurbit crops. They're obligate parasites, so they're actually just growing on the foliage. So you can see here early on in the season when you identify little small colonies of it, but eventually it's going to get bigger, bigger until it's been covering the entire leaf. So heavily infected foliage can eventually just kill off the entire leaf, which obviously will affect photosynthesis and other plant processes. So to manage powdery mildew, you can allow good space and air movement, because kind of unlike other fungal diseases, powdery mildew likes the hot conditions. It likes humidity, but only within the plant canopy itself. So that's why we recommend spacing it out. If you want to find varieties that have some resistance already, those are definitely on the market. And then different fungicide options include copper sulfate, sulfur, potassium bicarbonate. On that list I handed out, there's a fungicide table with lots of options you can pick from. Okay, so I'll kind of go through this one quick. So we were talking about the wilt diseases earlier. There's Fusarium oxysporum, and Verticillium dahliae, and Verticillium alboatrum. So these are those soil-borne fungal pathogens, and they both kind of cause similar damage. Fusarium oxysporum is kind of similar to powdery mildew. There's specific species of it that are host-specific. So this is the one that will affect our pumpkins. And then obviously it's causing wilting in the plant. The pathogen itself, it's attacking the cambium tissue. So if you do like a cross section, so this was a squash, I cut a cross section of the root and the crown of the plant, you can see that brown discoloration of where it's kind of died back from that fusarium. And then the leaves themselves might express some dieback as well. So to manage that, you could source out cultivars that have been bred to have resistance to Fusarium and Verticillium. And then like it was shared earlier, the cover crop method of different mustards can be really good for your soil. There's actually tons of studies out there that show the different biofumigation properties. And then specifically, it's the high presence of the gluconolates, I think I pronounced that right. That is what's killing that pathogen within the soil. So like we were talking about earlier, like you can grow that, cut it down, and then work it into your soil. And then if you really want to get fancy there, you can graft different rootstocks. So again, find a variety that's resistant, and then graft the actual variety you want onto the plant. But this is kind of more of a complicated process and not something that a home grower might do. Okay, to finish it up, I just want to talk about rots. So there's Fusarium again. There's different Pythothera. That's a fun one. Can everyone say Pythothera? Pythothera. Pythium and and Alternaria. So these are different rots that can cause different fruit rots, like you see here, kind of superficial surface rots, and different crown and root rots. So several different species. And how we can prevent these is just good management practice. Avoid a bunch of standing water, especially if your fruit's touching that standing water, because a lot of these spores of the pathogens, they're called zoospores, so they move with the water, and that's how they can get from plant to plant. At the end of the season, you can remove coal piles near the sites, because this is like a good breeding ground for different fungal pathogens. And then there was a really good fact sheet I passed out from Michigan. They talk about different preventative fungicides and different active ingredients. So I didn't check to see if like those products are available or allowed in Utah, but I'm sure they are. And again, preventative fungicides are stuff you just spray to prevent them in the first place. So any questions about diseases or other insects?